further into the Friday the 13th series I get, the more info, tidbits of trivia, revelations, and overall observations I feel the need to point out. So this one might be a bit longer than the previous ones. Strap in, folks. It's time for another Friday the 13th. Welcome back to ML Miller Frights, a part of the Kings of Horror Network. I'm ML Miller. While you might be watching this video on the Kings of Horror Network, I urge you to click over to my ML Miller Frights page and give it a like, share with your buddies across the electronic superhighway, click subscribe to this channel, and don't forget to ring that bell for notifications. Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D was released in 1982. It's included in the Shout Factory Friday the 13th Collection Deluxe Edition box set. You can find the link to that down in the comments. Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D was directed by Steve Miner, and it was written by Martin Kittrosser, Carol Watson, and based on characters created by Victor Miller, Ron Kurtz, and Sean S. Cunningham. In Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D, a group of kids show up at Higgins Haven, a lake house and farm on the lake that borders Camp Blood, which is where the previous murder spree occurred. This film takes place a day after Jason murders those attempting to reopen the camp in the previous installment, making this one take place technically on Saturday the 14th. Chris, played by Dana Kimmel, is a survivor of an attack by a mysterious man 2 years prior, and returns to the area in order to find closure. Joined by her friends and her pushy former squeeze, Rick, played by Paul Kratka, the group sets out to party for the weekend, but soon finds themselves in the sights of Jason Voorhees, played by Richard Brooker, who survived after having taken out the camp counselors at Camp Crystal Lake the night before. The special features let you know that there were multiple takes on this film before settling on simply washing, rinsing, and repeating the story from Part 2. Amy Steele didn't want to come back to play Ginny, so the idea that the story would continue to follow Part 2's survivor as she struggled with her sanity in an asylum was scrapped. Apparently, Miner originally wanted to make Part 3 as a mystery as well, having the audience guessing who the killer was once again. Friday the 13th Part 3 is the first film in the series that drops the mystery angle, and it never really came back until the somewhat unpopular fifth installment. I think this ended up hurting the series as a whole, given that the mystery angle was a main part of the first two films. Even in Part 2, we were questioning who it was doing the killings, until it was officially revealed as Jason at the end. In Part 3, the kids at Higgins Haven seemed to know nothing about Jason, despite Chris and Rick being annual visitors to the area, which seems to be on the same lake as Camp Blood, and only down the road a piece. There's no expositional drop in regards to the backstory of Pamela and Jason's reign of terror, aside from a news report at the beginning. None of the victims of this onslaught had any idea who was picking them off. Aside from the opener, catching up the audience, the words Pamela or Jason Voorhees are never used by the cast. This is the first one of the series where it's pretty apparent there was much studio interference going on. By now, the studios realized they had a cash cow on their hands, and the desire to connect with a wider audience prompted the casting of one of those multiracial biker gangs that you only see in movies, TV, and comics, and the inclusion of the Cheech and Chong-esque Chili and Chuck. Chili, played by Rachel Howard, and Chuck, played by David Katims, seemed way older than the rest of the cast, and really had no reason to be there other than to make the pot smokers in the audience giggle a bit with the mention of pot. I have to say, even back then, I hated the hippies, and felt they were completely out of place. Another concept that the studios played with was to have Cheech and Chong actually meet Jason, much like when Abbott and Costello met the Universal monsters in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Thank God that concept was scrapped. But instead we got Chili and Chuck, who simply function on a different plane and barely interact with the rest of the group until they're finally killed unceremoniously. Inexplicably, the entire cast feels a lot older than the previous film. I don't know if it was intentional, maybe they were going for a more mature audience, or maybe casting just found older people and felt they could pass as kids. They don't, though. They don't really mention being in high school or in college. They might actually be 20-somethings, and in some cases 30 and 40-somethings. Still, Rick, Chili, and Chuck seem especially out of place hanging out with the rest of the cast. I get why they added the gang. Though they are an extraneous addition, it makes for more kills, offers up a more diverse cast to attract quote-unquote urban viewers who lack the ability to empathize with characters unless they have the same skin tone. Still, I appreciate the way Fox, Ali, and Loco all have their own personalities. They could have been written as one-note jerks, just as a threat to give Shelley an arc to play the hero. But instead, in the short time they were on screen, they're given a surprising amount of personality. Though their retribution of taking the gas is pretty cartoonish, it still manages to become a major plot point, as siphoning the gas from the cars is what slows Chris down from escaping Jason later on. Each of their deaths, especially Fox and Ali's, are poignant and they really resonate. Another vie to appeal to everyone can be found in the absolutely unscary disco score that plays over the beginning and end credits. They should have just stuck in the classic score, as the funk really does date the film more than anything else. I'm glad Manfredini was still part of the third installment, but I can't say the funky disco tunes were nightmare-inducing. It's still kind of fun to listen to. Despite the disco opening and the closing music, Manfredini's score still adds so much to the tension and drama of this installment. Now for a few firsts and a few random facts about the third installment. There's not one but two scenes of people taking a shit and neither wipe their ass, and that's just goddamn gross. I love the Chrismobile. Apart from Ginny's VW and maybe Court's mobile home, none of the vehicles in the Friday the 13th series have the personality that the Chrismobile had. I love it simply because it has Chris written in cursive on the driver's door. It's so 80s. I also love the letter punch label above the reserve gas switch. It's all hokey, but anyone whose parents or older siblings had a van in that era will appreciate Chris's sweet-ass ride. Part 3 has the first Latinx with the fiery Vera, Catherine Parks, though I can't confirm if she really is that nationality or simply playing a part. Still, she was hella spunky and had all the makings of a final girl. The second cop we see at the end as they take Chris out looks a lot like a young Officer Rick Cologne from Part 6. You know, wherever the red dot goes, ya bang. I know it's not him, but my continuity-savvy mind wants to believe this is rookie Rick Cologne on one of his first days with the Force, taking his first taste of Crystal Lake mayhem, and that fuels him to send away for a giant revolver with an even bigger laser scope. Part 3 sports the first death of a pregnant woman with Debbie, Tracy Savage, though there's no real mention of it after the first scene, and one might think that a pregnant woman might be sacred enough to save as the final girl. But apparently not. In addition, Andy, played by Jeffrey Rogers, and Debbie's relationship was well communicated and really strong. In very few scenes, these two were an extremely likable couple who seemed to have a strong love for one another. Something later installments forget to add in. As a side note, Andy and Shelley, played by Larry Zerner, have a great rapport. You could see why these two were roommates, having the same interests and skills. For the most part, this cast as a whole, though older, felt comfortable and very relatable. Fangoria makes an appearance in the film series for the first time, though not the last, which is only fair since the magazine, which was a favorite of mine as a kid, featured Friday the 13th films multiple times on its covers. Replacement Ralph, known as Abel, played by David Wiley, pales in comparison to the real thing. It's frustrating that they bring back the old crazy coot character, yet killed off the genuine creepy Ralph, Walt Gorney, in the last film. While every installment has its pranksters, Shelley, played by Larry Zerner, takes the cake. Many hate his schlubby poor me attitude, but he adds a lot to the tension in this one, and he even has a chance at a hero's redemption arc as well. This one does a lot with the character. Eventually it boils down to a boy that cried wolf scenario, but leading up to it, I would have been fine with Shelley being the final boy. This one has a few girl and guy candidates in Vera, Shelley, and Chris, and while I love Chris, I wouldn't have been mad seeing any of these actors wear the iconic final girl role. Because 3D was having a mini resurgence at the time, the studios decided to cash in on the craze and made this one in 3 dimensions. It's quite obvious that most of the attention in Part 3 was on the technical level, with scores of scenes focused on giving the viewer that coming at you effect. What the filmmakers didn't count on was that without the added dimension to see, the film really pales in comparison to Part 2 in quality of story, acting, and pretty much everything else. I always thought the coming at you effects were more lame rather than charming and served as an obvious distraction from the script. Crazy fan theory time. The big controversy of Friday the 13th Part 3 is if Chris was raped or not by Jason when she encountered him in the woods 2 years prior. Part of me thinks he did it, from the way Chris described it. Part of me thinks it's out of character for Jason to act out sexually, since he never does it any time before or after this occasion. Part of me wants to think that Miner was thinking of continuing the mystery aspect, which began in the previous Friday the 13th films, and had the rapist's identity be the mystery in this film. While in the film, Jason is ID'd by Chris. Maybe there was a version of the script that went in a different direction. This is all hypothetical, but had there been a few story edits, it might have been an interesting turn to have the super pushy Rick actually be the guy who accosted Chris in the forest after dropping her off at her parents' house on their date years ago. I think it would have made for a much more interesting story to have Chris come to the realization that it wasn't a giant boogeyman who abused her, but her boyfriend. And then, of course, Jason kills him and then tries to kill Chris. Rick is wearing a sweater just like the one Pamela Voorhees was wearing, which might have been some kind of unused visual clue as to how much of a threat he was to Chris. Taking this into account and seeing how Rick is a big guy who spends most of his conversations with Chris explaining how important his sexual needs are to the relationship, I wonder if they were trying to have Rick be some kind of red herring for the killer and or rapist attacker, and since the attention was all about the 3D at the time, the idea was never fully realized and eventually forgotten. Or I could just be trying to polish a turd of a script with no mystery by wishing some mystery into it. Either way, it's a fun fan theory, and I wanted to get it out there. I do think that the chase scene in Part 3 was pretty epic. It's just as strong as the chase from Part 2, and I go back and forth between which one I favor. Chris is amazing as the final girl, flipping the fuck out numerous times and slashing blindly and really whittling away at Jason's key areas before planting the final headshot with the axe in the end. Seeing her lose her mind numerous times is fantastically fun and tragic all at once. The final moments, as she switches emotions on a dime, is haunting. On top of that, the barn makes for a very strong set piece, and the film sure does make the most of the setting, going in and out and up and down the place for a big part of the movie. It does make for a sweet place where Jason can take his pick from the rusted tools laying around. Richard Booker makes for a more lumbering and brutish Jason compared to Dash's limber and livelier take on the role in Part 2, showing off Jason's strength and resilience here as Booker swings his weapons powerfully at his victims, but does just as much damage with his bare hands. I'm not a fan of the nonchalant way Booker drops the harpoon and saunters away after he murders Vera. It feels too lax and non-motivated. I love Booker's later chase scenes, but leading up to that final cat and mouse, it lacks that oomph other Jason actors have given. While Stan Winston made the original sculpt of the final look of Jason, they decided to change it up, and I think the latter version is miles better than what Winston delivered. Winston's looked more like a flesh pumpkin, closer to the god-awful Part 8 face. I think the final design they went with continued to highlight how deformed Jason's head was. Still, the short neck of the mask prosthetic really gives Jason a hunchback sort of look with sloping shoulders and no neck. Jason gets his iconic mask in this installment, which is cool. They make the transition in an almost uneventful way, but I really wish the film series would have pushed the theme of Jason wanting to cover up his face in front of other people. It's obvious his need for a mask comes from his deformity and has its origins in his youth. It also adds to the sympathy the character often receives, but it never is really fully stated right out. I like it that there isn't a strict moment pointing this out to the camera, but a simple wince as his face is revealed might make for some good character. That doesn't happen, as Jason seems at his most evil when he lets the mask slip and Chris sees it, realizing who he really is and how he is connected to her past. The end also had multiple versions. Originally, Chris thinks she sees Rick in the home, runs to him and sees Jason instead, who beheads her, and then she wakes up with the cops taking her off in the cop car. There's also an ending where Chris beheads Jason, but they ruled against that because they wanted to leave the ending open. While I like the full circle dream ending, with Chris being pulled into the lake by a ghostly Pamela Voorhees, now intact and snake-ridden, it really makes no sense that Chris would dream that since she seems to know nothing about Jason's backstory and her connections to Pamela. While Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D isn't my favorite of the series, it still is far and above my least favorites. It has some story issues, some acting missteps, and some obvious studio finagling, some goofy 3D effects, and some wonky out-of-place characters. But it still has some strong kills, iconic characters in Chris, Shelley, Vera, Andy, Ali, and Fox, and a fantastic final chase sequence. This installment feels more like a leveling off of quality, but it still is far and above some of the best slasher stuff of that decade. That'll be it for today. Please chime in the comments and let me know what you think of this video, how on the nose or mind-numbingly wrong I am, or you can counter with your own review. If you like this video, please pound that thumbs up button. Share this video with your social media addicted pals. If you're looking for written reviews, you can find them on mlmillerwrites.com. Don't forget, I have 2 new horror comic book trade paperbacks you should look for. Grave Trancers is out right now, and Pirouette, collecting never-before-published issues, will be out in November 18th in only the finest of comic book stores. And be sure to subscribe to this channel and ring that bell for alerts to be the first to see my future videos. Thank you so much for your time, and take care.
You're doomed to live the life you're meant to be, stuck inside your